So our objectives from this talk is, initially the first one was going to be to discuss the importance of studying pandemics. However, current events have proven that objective fruitless. So we're going on to describe the events of and development of the 1918 pandemic, discuss measures and policies instituted in response to this pandemic, mostly focusing on the U.S. response due to availability of documentation, analyze consequences and lessons learned from this pandemic, and then evaluate the responses to the 1918 flu in light of our current outbreak worldwide. So for disclaimers, I have no conflicts of interest to report. And a quick disclaimer, not in relation to conflicts of interest, pandemic flu and the SARS coronavirus 2, or the virus causing COVID-19 syndrome, are very different viruses. For example, very different case fatality rates, and this new virus seems to be a bit more infectious than the old one. So this can't be used as a prediction of where our current issues will be headed. So a little bit about the 1918 influenza. It's a type A H1N1 strain of influenza of debated origins. It's not particularly certain where this came from. There are a couple prevailing theories we'll go over later. This virus lasted overall from roughly summer, late spring of 1918 to the summer of 1919, and we'll go through the different waves of this pandemic as well later on. This one spreads via droplets, mostly an airborne spread, as all influenza is, and it infected an estimated 500 million people, which at the time in 1918 was 27% of the world population. A lot of these figures are estimated due to just the availability of data from that time. And then killed roughly, contemporary estimates back in 1918 said around 21 million people. Most recent paper I've seen published trying to estimate the death toll from this pandemic said 50 million, but said it could have been even higher. So in the other corner, to go over medicine at the time of this, medicine had started to go into what they called the modern scientific era, where rather than using folk remedy and anecdotal evidence and panaceas, we started going towards evidence-based medicine. We had started developing vaccines, but it had not developed one for the flu yet. The first effective flu vaccine will come later in the 1920s. Microscopes were recently invented and popularized, starting to be used widely as part of the typical workflow for doctors caring for their patients. At the time, influenza was widely thought to be caused by a bacterium called Haemophilus influenza. Today, at the time, it was called Pfeiffer's bacillus. And this bacteria was discovered in 1892. And this pandemic actually helped discredit the idea that Haemophilus influenza was the causative organism of this disease. Viruses at the time were considered an unconfirmed theory. It was known that polio and rabies were potentially viruses, mostly because they couldn't find a bacterium or other organism that they could see causing these diseases. Primary method of combating infections at this time was serums, which relates to our picture on the right. The picture shows someone drawing blood from a horse. Essentially, for serums, you would culture the organism you believe to be causing a disease, inject the causative organism into horses, give them some time to develop antibodies to the organisms you've cultured, and then extract their blood and extract the serum of the blood, the part containing the proteins and the immunoglobulins, and injecting that into your patients to help boost the immune response to the disease. We don't use these anymore due to issues with serum sickness and the advent of antibiotics. Antibiotics, unfortunately, won't be discovered and popularized until 1928 and really won't become fully available until the late 1930s, early 1940s. Continuous oxygen, because this is a respiratory illness, was first reported use in 1890 and steadily was gaining prominence through World War I, mostly in treating chemical-related injuries, though was attempted for this. Their respirators, the iron lung, was not invented until the 1920s, and ventilators, the kind of the sequel to respirators, won't come around for another couple decades. As well, for public health measures, influenza was considered a seasonal disease, not reportable. No, people rarely kept data on how influenza was trending. And yes, because they had treatments for infectious diseases, people at the time were theorizing that all infectious diseases will end very soon with their wonderful serums and vaccines. So what was different about this strain from the seasonal flu that didn't require as much concern? And this graph kind of demonstrates the big difference is the spike in mortality within the age range of the young adults. This was true for young adults involved in World War I, which was happening along the same time, as well as young adults at home in the civilian population. So somehow this particular strain of the flu was able to cause severe damage to the lungs in this patient population, and that's why it became such a concern. And it's why we monitor influenza for a peak in these populations even to this day. When we start seeing severe illness in young people, we start worrying about this virus or something similar returning again. So the typical strain of flu in those days, you can see the dotted line is the 1911 to 1917 statistics, and to this day, this is mostly the graph you'll see. Influenza tends to affect the very young and the very old, and not be particularly virulent for those in the middle. But this one had that peak. So another hypothesis as to why this peak existed was that data from going back to preserve specimens from the early 1900s showed that H3 flu strains seemed to be more common, in that in the years after this age group was born, up until this H1N1 1918 strain. Thus, the thought might have been that these individuals had no exposure to the H1 and had a vigorous immune response, resulting in cytokine storms. There's also the thought, even though we have the genome sequenced for the H1N1 virus, that there might have been some mutation going on in its particularly fatal times that we just don't know how that occurred and how this flu was able to be so deadly. The origin of this flu. So I already alluded to the fact that it was debated pretty frequently. DNA studies show it's of an avian origin, so it was a cross from likely avian livestock over to humans, sometime in the early 1918, 1917. Exact start is pretty widely debated. The most common theory is that this emerged in Kansas, within the United States. An unusual strain of flu was reported in spring 1918, so just before this pandemic started hitting, with a predilection for fatalities in young adults. This was followed by the first acknowledged case of flu linked to this pandemic at Camp Funston, an Army camp in Kansas. Other theories is that this may have come from China. China at the time had been undergoing significant civil strife, and there was a reported winter sickness, but without proper infrastructure and health infrastructure at the time, it's uncertain what the winter sickness was, other than some form of respiratory illness. China had sent, around the same time in early 1918, a labor corps that was shipped across Canada in these tightly packed cattle cars, with a respiratory illness breaking out by the time they got onto boats destined for Europe and the Western Front. Thus, this became a popular theory, but it has been debunked somewhat due to some genetic analysis of the initial disease affecting the Chinese. However, one point to the credit of this particular hypothesis is that China had a relatively low impact from the 1918 flu when it cycled back around to the world. And the last theory that isn't widely believed is that this actually came out of the UK. There were outbreaks of a fatal respiratory illness in hospital camps noted in late 1917, which also temporarily fits with development of this disease. I can't offer you exact cause, but these are the commonly held theories. So the initial response when this first started cropping up within the U.S. Was mostly nothing. Army camps were overcrowded because the U.S. was mustering up to send soldiers to war, and it was well beyond the regulations of the Army at the time. So it's not a lesson we've learned since then, it's a lesson we already knew, however ignored. The Rockefeller Center in the United States was kind of in charge of monitoring for outbreaks and trying to prevent them, because it was known that an outbreak will happen once you crowd all these people together. However, they were mostly focused on preventing measles, the measles outbreak at the time, though they did develop a pneumonia vaccine, which had some limited benefit in the diseases to come. So, without particularly effective quarantining or stopping this virus at the source within the U.S. Military camps, virus through either of the origins we discussed eventually ended up on the Western Front in World War I in 1918. This led to the second wave, which started in late summer, August. Initially, the first reports came out of Brest, France, Freetown in Sierra Leone, and Boston, Massachusetts. It's difficult to pinpoint a travel from the Western Front to those cities or from those cities between them, because it was all roughly around the same couple days. This was a far deadlier mutation of the strain. The prior strain did have a predilection for killing the young adult population, but wasn't as strong, and most people tended to recover from it. The evidence that this was the same strain that hit with that first wave that was coming across into France was cities such as Copenhagen, which were hit by that first wave, were also relatively spared by the second wave, but still posted mortality rates in right around 1%. Exact reason for this sudden lethality is unclear. Several theories have been proposed, and we may not know much more than this going on in the future. The cytokine storming we talked about earlier, the lack of the circulating H1 viruses in the years prior to 1918, resulting in reduced immunity in the general populace. It was one theory is that this was artificially selected for in the trenches. The sicker soldiers got, the more they rotate off the lines, the more they were exposed to other people. So the more severe symptoms caused by the virus had a better chance of spreading and continuing on. Another thought was the chemical agents used at the time are known now to be damaging to DNA and could have contributed to the randomization of mutations going on in the virus at the time. Regardless of the theory, this is what ultimately caused the 1918 pandemic to be so terrible. So, going into the responses to the second wave, at this point, it was very much noticed the virus had already spread almost across the world and would spread across all 6 inhabited continents. Unfortunately, harsh censorship measures on the press in countries involved in the war, the United States, France, Germany, UK, would prevent knowledge of getting out about this for some time due to a measure to preserve morale. Now, it wasn't like the people in the world just didn't know influenza was happening. They would still see more obituaries than usual, word of mouth, hearing of family and friends who are suddenly struck low by the flu, hearing of villages going dark due to flu running rampant. But this did lead to a variable response throughout the USA because different communities essentially selected what they would do about this themselves without any guidance from the federal government. New York City, because of how overcrowded it was at the time, was very used to running into pandemics and actually had a very proactive public health department. And we see one of their bulletins on the left, which, if you can read the small text on it, essentially gives the same public health measures we continue to give today. Cover up coughs, cover up sneezes, don't spit on the floor or sidewalk. Luckily, we don't have to say that as much these days. And then this bottom one says shun the common drinking cup. So don't share water, don't share food, avoid spread of droplets. They also instituted voluntary quarantines, which is something we've been hearing about recently. Staggered work hours. Now, there was no work from home in 1918. However, they did try to offset when people were on the streets going from home to work and back again by staggering the work hours at different factories and places of employment. Public events were canceled, but interestingly, except for Broadway, which was used as a public health teaching forum where before and after plays they would discuss how to these quarantine measures and how to prevent illness. Now, another topic to go into during the second wave was aspirin. Aspirin was kind of a newer drug at the time and was thought to basically cure everything. You see this list on a ad: headaches, colds, pains, neuralgias. So it was often used for treating the symptoms of this disease due to the joint aches and diffuse pains and headaches and cold-like symptoms. The antithrombotic potential had not been known of aspirin at the time. As you can see on this ad on the left, it says it in all caps, does not affect the heart, which we know is to not be true. Also at this time, the Bayer company, who originally patented aspirin, their patent was expiring. So around the time of this pandemic, generics were able to hit the market. So there was a flood of not well-regulated generics with variable dosing of the aspirin. The doses recommended anyways by JAMA and the U.S. Army Surgeon General were 8 to 31 grams daily, which is significantly higher than we will allow to be used today in medicine. So today, even loading dose for a heart attack, you typically would give a 325 of aspirin as your maximum daily dose, which is significantly lower than they were using at the time. So the thought is a lot of these people died of aspirin poisoning, causing hyperventilation, causing bleeds, and some of the symptoms of the flu at the time also discussed coughing up blood and bruises forming, perhaps more from the aspirin than from the actual disease. So one particular case to discuss during the second wave is Philadelphia. So I discussed how local governments were left to fend for themselves and how they responded to this virus. And Philadelphia is the case example of what not to do. The first case noted in Philadelphia was in a naval dockyard in September 19th, 1918. Quickly, a couple hundred people had started reporting symptoms of flu, and this was before this Liberty Loan Parade we see in the background. It was the largest war bond parade in the country. hundreds of thousands of people came in from all around Philadelphia to see this parade with thousands of people marching in it. They had airplanes buzzing overhead, they had speeches, but as you can see, people were very tightly packed close together in a city with flu already circulating in. A couple of days after this, the city itself started to shut down as flu cases ran rampant. Their morgue, which only had a capacity of 36, became backlogged, resulting in hospitals overflowing with dead patients and as well dying patients that they were attempting to treat. There are reports of private doctors, mostly their business was in house calls, doing upwards of 50 house calls a day due to flu. Add to this that a quarter of the doctors in the city were deployed in France at the time for the war. So they had diminished healthcare ability to respond, combined with just an overload on their healthcare system. As we see today with the flatten the curve, they had the exact opposite. Everything happened at once after this parade, and resulting in the city being non-functional. Interestingly, during this time, private citizens essentially volunteered and filled the gap that the city was unable to provide. They would volunteer their cars as ambulances, which were not used particularly at this time. The concept of like an ambulance and a 911 comes much later in American history. But this became like a proto ambulance and 911 service, with people volunteering time at the telephone switchboards to become 911 dispatchers and dispatch other volunteers to go drive the ill to hospitals. Philadelphia, at the end of this outbreak, will have 500,000 cases in total, 16,000 dead just within this city, and it's the worst hit city in the United States. So we discussed how they had already developed vaccines to polio, to rabies, anthrax. Polio actually came later. That was a misspeak, but anthrax, rabies. The vaccines were attempted to the flu. However, they're all developed against this Haemophilus influenza, resulting in failure in the serums. Now, it was still questioned whether H. flu actually caused the flu, and there was growing concern that this was more of a virus. So some of the producers would even mix in just whatever they found in sputum cultures and lung samples into their serums in hopes of accidentally catching this virus when they injected it into the horses and extract their immunoglobulins. However, that pneumonia vaccine we talked about the U.S. Army creating earlier had shown some data, not completely effective, but helped treat some of the secondary pneumonias and help people weather through this disease. The picture on the right, not left, is Oswald Avery, the man credited with developing this pneumonia vaccine. He will go on later to debunk the thought of proteins carrying genetic material, which helped further the development of the knowledge of DNA. So worldwide spread. So we're going to discuss what else was going on within the rest of the world. There aren't very good maps of the path of 1918 flu that I could find that were particularly helpful graphics. However, this one is particularly good for the United States, showing that each of these numbers represents a week. So within 6 weeks, flu was across the entire United States. This was before passenger airplanes were a thing. This was before the modern highway infrastructure. So this was all mostly rail cars and shipping that transported this virus across the country. So worldwide spread. So the first place hit by the second wave, due to it originating kind of within the Western Front and radiating out, was Germany. So initially it started on the Allied side of the war lines, went over to the German side, right as they were trying to do their final push and reverse their course in the war, and this virus is thought to have contributed to the failure of that push, the failure of them to be able to muster their forces. India, which not much data exists in, that's why I have a spread of 12 million to 17 million deaths, which is the most accurate figure we can come up with in our modern day reviews of this topic. In India, at the time under British rule, the British officials didn't provide much aid to their subjects during this and other pandemics. And this pandemic in particular, due to the failures of Western medicine to be able to treat this, and the British officials not providing much aid, helped further resentment and more Indians turning towards the independence movement as the people that they want to support, ultimately helping this independence movement gain credibility and contribute to independence in the next couple of decades. South Africa, one of the effects of this was hygiene laws instituted, which became part of the pillars of apartheid, which separated South African society between Caucasian and African populations. And these hygiene laws prohibited people from the country from traveling through cities without written permission. In Japan, this disease was called sumo disease, which started after a sumo match. So public gathering, very close, definitely not socially distant people. And this started a trend of wearing face masks within popular culture, which plenty of pictures from 1918 show people wearing what we see today as surgical masks throughout the world. Russia, we have a surprising, not too surprising, paucity of data on, and this is where a lot of the uncertainty in the death tolls and the amount of people infected comes from, because it was undergoing significant civil strife, civil wars, so it's just impossible to know how many people were affected by this disease. So, another case to go through because of some of our experiences with COVID-19 is an ocean liner called the USS Leviathan. So it was a German ocean liner turned into a U.S. troop transport, routinely carried around 11,000 troops. Actually, it had pneumatically sealed bunks for the troops. So it was thought while this flu was going around that these pneumatically sealed bunks would help isolate the infection to whoever lived in the bunk with the patient with the flu. However, an outbreak ran through the whole ship, despite these attempts to control the virus, resulting in 2,000 sick and 80 deaths on transit from U.S. to France. This is a article discussing the Diamond Princess cruise ship, which was put under quarantine and left us all wondering how this went so wrong. Interesting, given that we know from prior experience that ships are particularly good at spreading disease amongst their passengers, just due to how close and compact everybody is on these liners. So the third wave of the virus sometimes gets skipped over in reviewing the 1918 flu, but it was rather significant. It was much milder, far less deaths, but still a particular spike in deaths, as you can see in this graphic. The first wave being the one on the far left, second wave being the mountain in the middle, and the third wave being the aftershock later. So this third wave tended to occur as the war was wrapping up, and the motion of people around the world increased as soldiers were returning home. People started not isolating themselves as the disease seemed to have petered out, and then the disease spiked right back up. So the immediate aftermath of the 1918 flu was several aftershocks after the last wave, with local public gatherings, which persisted for a couple of years, This pandemic actually rapidly faded into obscurity. The thought is that it was kind of bundled with the memories of World War I, which also tended to fade into obscurity with the Great Depression and World War II after. And to this day, H1N1 remains a frequently circulating strain of the flu, though much milder than we saw in 1918. And it's a constant component of our flu vaccines yearly due to this concern. So what did we learn from this particular pandemic? One, the importance of honest communication between leadership and the populace. The censorship measures help contribute to the spread of this flu, as well as to the general panic that occurred throughout the second wave. Voluntary isolation when sick. We probably knew this lesson beforehand, but it's always good to reiterate. People to stay home when they're sick, avoid spreading the disease. They staggered work hours, which today we have interpreted as working from home when possible, reducing the chance of running into infected people now to hopefully none. No large public gatherings. We saw this very early in the COVID outbreak, where large public gatherings and public events were being canceled even before we saw this rapid uptick in cases. As also evidenced by the fact that I'm presenting this via the internet rather than in person in a large public group. As well, we learned to cover coughs and sneezes. New York actually outlawed this during the 1918 flu. Wouldn't be surprised if they tried to outlaw it again. And eventually we learned the lesson to not just spit on the sidewalk in public. As well, to avoid unnecessary travel. Motion of infected people is how these diseases spread. So, this concludes my talk on the 1918 flu. These are my the resources I used. Most of them came from around the times of the SARS outbreak, due to people having the same desire to look back to the lessons learned and to help guide them through that almost pandemic, and then this one as well. Thank you for your time. Have a good night.